AAA Live! AAA Live! AAA Live!
Ang palatuntunang maghahatid sa inyo ng kaalaman sa edukasyon upang magbigay liwanag at gabay sa ating mga mag-aaral at magulang.
Where your academic goals will be advanced and achieved. AAA Live!
Lilinang ng inyong talento at huhubog ng inyong husay upang magtagumpay sa karerang tatahaking
AAA Live!
At ngayon, narito ang guro ng bayan, Attorney AMIHAN April ALCAZAR.
Audience and televiewers from the Philippines and around the world. So this is Attorney AMIHAN April M. ALCAZAR, the President Emeritus of the Philippine Association of Extension Program Implementers and your host for AAA Live here at Katipunan channel. We're airing every Wednesdays, 7 to 8 in the evening. You may follow, like, and subscribe to us at our YouTube and Facebook channels for Katipunan channels for any of your comments and questions. So for today, we have a very interesting topic, which I'm sure all of our audience, mainly our students, parents, educators, and all that are interested in the education sector will be very interested here. So here at AAA Live, where your academic goals are advanced and achieved, we would like to give you some insights, perspectives, and different issues and concerns regarding our education sector in the Philippines. So our field for today will be English as a second language or English as a foreign language. So are you challenged with respect to the teaching and learning of this language? Well, we have our guest for today is Professor Stephen Ray Gershon. So he's very familiar with our topic for tonight. He was actually a visiting professor before at the Ateneo de Manila University, and this is how he came to the Philippines. And so we're very fortunate to have him tonight to join us. So we are actually interviewing him from Tokyo, Japan, where he is based currently. And so I think we will ask Professor Stephen Ray Gershon to give some of his greetings to our audience. Good evening, Professor Gershon.
Good evening. Magandang gabi. How are you, everybody? Kumusta ka?
Yes, so I think not only is he very fluent in English, I think he also learned a lot of Tagalog while he was here in the Philippines.
Konti lang.
Konti. That's very good, Steve. So I think let's delve right into this very interesting topic, because this is really an interest for all of us actually here in the Philippines, how it came about that the English language was really adopted as a medium of instruction here in the Philippines when mass education was introduced during the time of the American colonial government here. So I think let's start actually, Steve, with your personal history on how you came about to actually study English and to eventually teach English as a second or as a foreign language. Maybe you can give us a little bit about your background.
Okay, sure. First of all, everybody keep in mind that I have been teaching a very, very long time, and I graduated from university even a longer time ago, and I'm getting older and older, so my memory is becoming weaker and weaker. But I will do my best. So basically, when I went to university as a typical American student, in my first 2 years of university, I really didn't know what I wanted to study. And so like many students, I took what's called general education classes. And I was not required to choose a major until my third and fourth year of university. Okay, but they were very tumultuous times in the US and in the world at that time. This was in the very early 1970s. And so what I ended up doing,
activism, yes.
Yes, it was the anti-Vietnam War and protests and demonstrations. And it was a very vibrant but very divisive time. And so after 2 years of university, I actually dropped out of university and basically traveled around the world for a few years because I had no idea what I wanted to do.
Okay, so I think I'll just like to relate that to what the experience of our students are. Maybe this is a kind of conundrum or concern that they have, you know, when they're going to college, they don't exactly know what it is that they might actually be studying. So I think this is kind of relatable to our students. Unfortunately, the situation right now, as you know, is we have introduced senior high school in the Philippines. And therefore, the choice of what they might actually be studying in college should have been prepared for and made even at the time when they go to grade 11 or start senior high school in the Philippines. So what happened after you had traveled the world? Did you resume your studies?
Yes. So I ended up living in London, in England, for a while, and I was only able to get kind of factory jobs, very low-paying jobs, and I suddenly realized, oh my God, if I don't go back and get my university diploma, this is the kind of work I will be doing for the rest of my life.
Okay, so take note, students and parents.
Yes.
This is not an issue that is only unique to the Philippines. You know, some students might have difficulty determining what it is that they would want to do in their lives.
Yeah.
They might spend a few years away from school. But eventually, maybe you start to realize that if you really wanted to have more of a career, and specifically in whatever field of study you're interested in, maybe there comes a point in time that you really have to decide to return to school. And you did return to school.
I did. You know, as the saying goes, the only thing more expensive than a good education is a poor education.
Exactly. So I think that's a
because you pay for a poor education your whole life.
Yeah. So because if you don't return to school, ladies and gentlemen, to our audience, maybe as what Steve was saying, that you will have to really be determining your future for your whole life, basically, right? So what happened next, Steve?
So after basically I had been out of university for 5 years.
Wow, that's a long time.
I went back to California and I enrolled at California State University. But at that time, I still wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to study. So I think I entered as a geography major, and then I transferred to psychology major. And what happened really was I took a required seminar class that was a literature class, and it opened my eyes. And I thought, you know, literature, English language, it really opened myself up to what language and communication and literature could do for.
So eventually, Steve, so you actually were able to finish really at the California State University your bachelor's in English, correct?
I got my bachelor's in English, and then I stayed on for one graduate year to my California State high school teaching credential for English. So I became a high school English teacher.
Okay, so that really determined for you at least one career trajectory. So I think the wisdom here is that even though it might have been like a circuitous event that you had to find your interest, maybe sometimes this is like the most decisive point of your life when you really make a decision. This is the kind of profession that I would like to be in. And so you were basically on your way to your career, correct? So you qualified as a California high school teacher in English. What happened then?
So what happened? It was bad timing. So what
Really?
happened was right when I graduated, there was a new tax law in the state of California that effectively meant no public sector employees were going to be hired for the next year, 2 years, 3 years, because the tax base was defunded. It was decreased. So what happened was my wife, who is British at that time, and I, we decided to just take off, throw caution to the winds, and move to London.
Okay, so you moved back to England, right?
We moved back to England. So what happened in England then was that the Department of Education and Science, which is what controls the, you know, like the Ministry of Education, right? Like the equivalent of DepEd.
Yes, in the Philippines,
they would not recognize my American qualification.
Okay. So again, this is an important lesson for everyone, that when we acquire our academic credentials, it's very important that they may be recognized everywhere, right? That's why it's important for all of us to actually go to the higher education institutions, at least in the Philippines, that are recognized by the Commission on Higher Education. The reason is because these are the institutions that can be recognized in other countries. Correct, Steve? So since they didn't recognize it, what then can you do?
Right. So eventually they did recognize it after many letters and me ranting and raving at them. But it
documents, of course.
Documents, but it took maybe a year, year and a half before that happened. So in the meanwhile, I was thinking, what can I do? And I noticed one day, probably in the newspaper or maybe an advertisement on the street, this field called TEFL.
Okay, and what does it mean?
Teaching English as a Foreign Language.
Okay.
I had no idea what it meant, really.
Yes. So did you explore
what I noticed is they had 1 month intensive training courses, after which you could be qualified to teach English in a language school.
Okay.
So now remember, this was London, right? And London, there are
English speaking supposedly
from all over the world flocking to London who want to learn English.
Yes.
Right. So I took the training course. I got the teaching certificate.
Yes.
And I started teaching in a language school in central London. And that was my first experience of teaching English language to non-native English speakers.
Okay. So how did that experience eventually shape your career then?
Well, how it shaped my career is that, you know, in the environment or the milieu of the language school, the teachers who were teaching at the language school, the students that were there, I suddenly connected the ideas of teaching travel.
Yes. Yes.
That, you know, it suddenly became clear to me that the whole world wants to learn English.
Exactly. Right?
Teaching English as a foreign language could be a passport or a visa for the world.
Yes. So with this eureka moment, Steve, what can you say eventually were the skills and the aptitude that you should have been proficient in or had developed by this time that made you decide on this particular career to be a professor, a teacher for English language as a foreign language or to non-native English speakers?
Yeah, well, of course, number one is communication skills.
Yes.
Both orally and in writing.
Yes, and
Right.
you're not only talking as a native English speaker here,
No,
but
no,
in
no,
general, really, communication skills is paramount, correct?
it's communication skills are paramount. I mean, we all have heard and we all know about the important 4 C's,
Yes.
right? And
Which
number
are, for
one,
our review,
well, number 1 is communication.
yes.
Number 2, collaboration. In other words,
Yes.
being able to work as a member of a team.
Yes.
Number 3, critical thinking.
Okay.
And
Good.
number 4, creativity.
Okay.
And
So,
all of those skills come into play with teaching.
yes. Okay. So now that you're on the road here and say, okay, now I've decided that this is my passport or visa around the world. How then did you pursue your career eventually, both on a professional level and eventually on the experiential level?
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, it took about a year or so for the Department of Education and Science in Britain to recognize my American qualification. Eventually they did. And
Yes.
after they did, I ended up getting a teaching job in a regular British high school,
Okay. As a
teaching
teacher,
native English
right?
speaking kids, teaching
Yes.
native English speaking kids, right? In teaching high school English. And I did that in London for about 3 years.
Okay. But at the same time, were you teaching English as a foreign language to
No,
non-English
that was
speakers?
on the back burner at that
Mhm.
time. I
Yes.
had that qualification,
Yes.
but
Mhm.
but I still felt that
Mhm.
my prime profession was
Yes.
being a high school English teacher.
Okay. But
Okay.
eventually, did you change that direction?
Yes, and what changed that was one typically cold, bleak, dark, gray British winter day.
Something that we read of English literature always from Shakespeare or T.S. Eliot,
Yeah, and
correct?
it's all true, right? And I was teaching in inner city rough high schools.
Yes, in
And
London, right?
in London, in
Uh-huh.
inner London, in inner
Yes.
London. And
Yes.
it was rough and it was difficult.
Okay.
And I felt, maybe I wanted to change. So one day, out of the blue, I telephoned the Chinese embassy in London.
Okay. Yes.
Said,
And why would you do that?
well, simple. I telephoned. A nice Mr. Wong answered the phone.
Yes.
And I said, hello, do you need teachers?
Oh, yes.
In
And
China.
in China, correct?
Now,
And what did he tell you?
by this time, it
Mhm.
was around 1981.
Mhm.
Okay. And he said, come down to the embassy. Let's have a
Yeah.
chat. So
Okay.
my wife and I, we went down there. We talked to him. We filled out some papers.
Mhm.
And he said, I will send these papers, your information, your CV,
Mhm.
all your resume, all of that. I will send all of that to Beijing. And
Yes.
if they're interested, I will get back to you.
Okay. So this
So
was
I
the
went
age
back.
of snail mail, right?
Yeah, this is all of this was, of course, pre-internet days.
Yes,
Right?
I think
No-
our audience
no
will have to be
personal
informed
computers.
about that. So no internet, no computers, everything has to be sent by mail.
That's right. That's right. And so I went back to teaching high school, and about, I don't know, 9-10 months later,
Yes, it took that
a call
long from the phone
Mr.
call,
Wong
right?
and said a university in China, Henan University, would like to appoint you and your wife
Uh-huh.
as professors for a year. Are you
Yes.
interested?
Yes.
And I said, yes. So
Okay, great.
in 1982, we went to China
Mhm.
to teach English at a university in the central part of China.
Okay. And this was just at the time when China was really just opening up into the world, correct?
Yeah. Well, my wife, we were the only foreigners in the whole city.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. And how was that experience, Steve? Non-native English speakers all around you.
Bizarre.
Really?
It was like living, I mean, you can imagine like, a fishbowl kind of existence where
Yes.
kind of like being in a zoo, but you are the animals.
Exactly.
But it was
But-
also wonderful. And the
Yes.
students were fantastic. We were
Mhm.
treated very, very well.
Mhm.
And it was great for my career, my professional training.
Mhm.
We were there for 2 years.
Mhm.
We taught literature and
Mhm.
language
Yes.
to university students who were studying to
Mhm.
be English teachers.
I see. So
It's what's called in China a normal university, which
Yes.
means a teacher's university.
Well, if we look at our American colonial history here, so we have our Philippine Normal University
Yeah.
now. So that was established during the American time. And so it would refer really to the training of teachers, basically.
So that's exactly what we did. It was training teachers.
Yes. So from that experience in China that you actually realized that the whole world wanted to learn English, basically, at the
Yes.
time.
Yeah.
So how then did you pursue eventually that career then?
So I think that experience is what propelled the direction of my career.
Mhm.
Because from there, I decided that I wanted to get a master's degree
Mhm.
in applied linguistics.
Okay. Yes.
In other words,
And so you
like
did.
TESOL, right?
Yes.
Like TESOL.
So that meant that it was really for linguistics is a study of languages, and specifically here English as a second language or as a foreign language.
Exactly. So
Okay.
so that is the experience that, if you like, shifted my career
Mhm.
from being a high school English teacher for native English speaking kids
Yes.
to
Mhm.
teaching English as
Mhm.
a second or foreign language.
Yes. So I think our takeaway here, Steve, is that for our students or parents or all who are educators, sometimes it depends really on the students' pace of development. Sometimes they might not eventually find yet what it is that they are really interested to study.
Yes. Yeah.
But it's through possibly mentorship, guidance, and experiential learning that they may eventually find what it is that they're really interested to study and eventually pursue as a career.
Absolutely. I totally 100% agree that, those are the elements that I think all young people should be open to in finding their career path, to find what you have aptitude for, but also to find what you have interest and passion for.
Okay, so I think that that's our very important and crucial points here is that we have to determine what the aptitude of the student is or our skill set, and then eventually we have an interest in that field of study so that we will eventually be able, despite the difficulties, continue our commitment, and that's our passion for our studies.
Yeah.
So now that you've decided this is what you actually wanted to do, how then did you eventually decide now on the eventual career path that you took, which is that of a professor, as a textbook writer, and of course, an expert on the teaching of English as a second and a foreign language?
Right. So I decided to go back to Britain to get my master's degree, and that was at the University of Reading. And it was a very formative time for me, possibly or probably because this is in 1984. So we were in China from 1982 to 1984. So at that time, in the early 1980s, in the field of TESOL,
Yes,
was
or
a
English as a
lot
second
of
language.
change and innovation going on.
Okay. Mhm.
So it was a very exciting and formative time. Like
And
you say.
after acquiring your master's degree then,
Well,
so
so
were
what
you ready
happened?
to take on the world, basically?
Yeah. So what happened is after I got my master's degree, at the end of that course,
Yes.
we received a notice in our department that there were some professors from Japan who were
Yes.
coming on a recruitment trip to
Uh-huh.
find teachers to teach at universities in Japan.
Ah, okay. So that was
So
again a
I
possible
thought,
opportunity.
oh, that's interesting. My wife and I both, we had a great desire to come back to Asia.
Yes.
Not necessarily China, but
Mhm.
Asia, right?
Okay. And with that interest peaked, then did you go to Japan? And when was
Yes.
this?
So
Yes.
I signed up for an interview
Mhm.
at the University of Reading, where some
Yes.
Japanese universities were visiting for a few days. I
Yes.
interviewed and I was offered a
Mhm.
full-time position at a university in the Tokyo area.
Okay. And so, as they say, the rest is history,
And the
correct?
rest is it. Now what's interesting about that is that the first university that I was offered the position at and I came to, that was on the basis of a 2-year contract
Yes, at first.
that could be extended for 2 years and then another 2 years and then finished.
Okay. Yes,
And
okay.
so initially we thought we'd go to Japan for 2 years. But we got here and it was a whole new culture. It was interesting. It was fun. It was a new way of life. And we thought the first 2 years passed so quickly.
Yes.
We
So did you renew your contract?
we renewed and then we renewed again. And I should also add, before we came to Japan, we had a baby
Okay.
in
So
London.
in addition to all of the studying and moving, of course, life gets in the way.
Life gets in the way. So we had a baby.
Okay.
So we actually moved to Japan with a 2-month-old baby.
Yes, and that should have been like very exciting and interesting.
Very exciting, very interesting. And kind of what happened is that after 2 years and then after 4 years, we thought, wow, our child, Rebecca, is becoming bilingual. If we
Yes.
leave now, she'll lose that.
Yes,
Let's
exactly.
stay for one more contract.
Yes.
And then another contract. And then
Okay.
another contract. And 35 years later,
Yes.
still here.
Okay. And so I think you were actually shifting more now into what you were saying, Steve, about applied linguistics. So for
That's
the
right.
benefit of our audience, you were moving from the English language first for the native English speakers, and then eventually to the teaching of English as a second or as a foreign language to non-native English speakers, and
Yes.
then eventually for applied linguistics, which is really like the study of languages. And then you were talking about bilingualism, like how to develop students so that they can be proficient not only in one language, but could be 2 or 3 or more languages. So how would you explain now the field of linguistics, Steve?
Well, applied linguistics is if you like, the study of language in real live social contexts. Now, one area, probably the most prevalent area of applied linguistics, is second language teaching.
Yes.
But there are other areas of applied linguistics as well. So, for example, on my course at Reading, in my applied linguistics course with my cohort of students,
Yes.
most of us were English language educators, but
Yes.
Some of us were in the areas of, for example, speech pathology.
Yes. So
A
speech
few were
pathology would be
studying
like to
lexicography, like the
yes,
making of dictionaries,
yes,
right?
okay.
So there are different areas of applied linguistics. My specialization was the teaching of English as a second language.
Okay. So with that in mind now, my dear listeners and audience, of course, when you have like English as a second language or English as a foreign language, what do you think will be the most important driving force for students who would really like to improve their skill set in dealing with English if this is not their native language, meaning they will have to learn English as a second language or as a foreign language, and specifically for academic reasons, because this is our experience in the Philippines. Not only do we need to study English to be able to pass examinations in school, but eventually it will have an effect on what our careers are going to be like, Steve.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, mainly what I would say is in terms of skill set, there are, two skill sets that are crucial for,
yes. And these are?
English as a second language. One obviously is language itself.
Yes.
Which, when we talk about language, we talk about the language system, right? The language system,
yes.
the language system basically being composed of three sort of subsystems, if you like,
Okay.
right? There is lexis,
Yes,
right?
or
Vocabulary.
Yes,
There
vocabulary.
is structure, which
grammar.
is syntax or grammar,
Mm-hmm.
right? And there is phonology, which is the sound system of a language.
Exactly.
And
Yes.
so, in the study of language, one has to be adept and knowledgeable about how those subsystems work together to create language.
Yes,
Right?
exactly.
So that
So I think with these three
that's
systems, we have to take note and emphasize this to our audience, what he mentioned about one, vocabulary, then second is the grammar, and the third will be the sound system. So what kind of experiential learning you think or experiences students here in the Philippines can acquire to greatly improve on those three aspects? So let's start with vocabulary, Steve.
Well, I think for vocabulary, you need as wide a vocabulary as possible. We talk about the GSL, right? The General Service List of English, which includes the 2,000 most frequent words of English. And then you have to build from there.
Yes. So again, take note of that.
Base.
Yes, he mentioned about the 2,000 words of vocabulary that are frequently used in English. So for one to be proficient in English, you will have to at least be familiar with these 2,000 words of English. Now, what can you say about the second aspect, which is on the grammar side? I'm sure some of our students are already shaking their heads when you mention grammar because it gives them a headache, Steve.
Yeah, well, grammar gives everybody a headache, right?
Yes.
Grammar is the thing that basically nobody loves, but everybody has to deal with.
Yes, and this is what we actually study in school.
The problem is in one's native language, we take the structure, the grammatical structure of our language for granted. We speak our native language fluently and accurately.
Yes.
But if we are asked to analyze or describe how the structures, the grammatical structures of the language work, most lay native speakers, not teachers, but lay native speakers, wouldn't have any idea how to explain it. You know,
Exactly.
what is
And
a prepositional phrase? What
yes.
is,
And so that is,
what is
I
the
think, what
present
is,
perfect?
yeah, so that would be very distinctive, looking at it from the perspective of English as a second language, as a foreign language, that the
Yeah.
grammar will have to be understood by the
Yeah.
students
And
who
I would
already
say,
learn English.
as a teacher,
Mhm.
what's important is being able to not necessarily explain grammar,
Mhm.
but present grammar.
Grammar. See. Okay, and then
Learning,
yes.
as a teacher,
Mhm.
learning how to present grammar both
Mhm.
deductively and inductively, so
Mhm.
that it sinks in with the students, and being able to design lessons
Yes.
that can present grammar,
Mhm.
get students to practice grammar, and get students to produce the target structures that
Mhm.
you are working on.
Okay. And then lastly, of course, is the phonology, or you mentioned about the sounds, which now goes into the listening skills. So in this age of multimedia, like social media and broadcast media, how then could they be acquiring this ear or knowledge about the sounds of English, which will help them develop the skills for the
Well,
language?
we talk about the four language skills, right? The
Mhm.
four language
Yes,
skills of course, reading, writing, speaking, listening. Now,
exactly.
they're called skills for a
Yes.
reason,
Yes, and the
right?
reason being,
The more you do it, the
yes.
better you get.
Okay. So do you actually advise, for example, this very interesting story that there's a very popular Korean boy band, BTS, and apparently one of the members said that he actually learned English because he was watching a television program from the United States. Is
Yeah.
that like one particular experience that people should or can have?
Yes, yeah, and it works for many people. The most important thing is, when it comes to learning or becoming proficient in a foreign language, whether it be English or Tagalog or Cebuano or whatever the language is, there's no one size fits all
Mhm.
prescription.
Yes. Okay.
You've got to find what works for you. Some people are more naturally oral learners.
Yes.
Some people are more naturally visual learners. Some
Yes.
people are more naturally analytical learners.
Learner. Okay.
And I think
So,
all learners have to find what
mm,
works for them. If watching TV or listening to bands or
mhm,
watching movies or reading love stories,
mhm.
whatever works, the most important thing is to get input, input, input.
Okay.
You
So
need
there you
as
have
much
it.
input
Really, it's like
as possible.
exactly. So the more you are interested to learn a language, the more you need input, input, and more
Yeah.
input regarding that language. So I think, we've really gone through like this minefield, I would say, for most students on what are some of the techniques eventually to really have a good grasp of a foreign language. And in this particular case, English, which is very important, I think, for the Philippines because we use it as a medium of instruction in school. And secondly, it has a bearing on how our career trajectory is going to be. So now that you have become a professor of English and specifically as a textbook writer, where do you think now the direction of English language teaching and learning in the world for non-native English speakers are going to?
Yeah. Well, I think after this past very new normal kind of
Yes.
year, I think
Yes.
we all understand
Mhm.
that that digital learning, educational technology
Yes.
is the future. That
Yes.
does not mean teachers will be replaced.
Yes,
But-
they will not be.
No, no. Students need the human element. Now, the human element can also come, as is happening right now,
Yes.
via a Zoom screen.
Yes.
But it's
Through
still the
technology.
human, it's still the human element, right? And I think that's going to remain important. But it seems to me that having gone through
Yes.
this painful past year of
Yes.
having to really learn new educational technology, sort of redesign the materials that I use to teach,
Yes.
find new approaches to get through to students via remote teaching. I think that, the teachers of the very, very, very near future
Yes.
will need to be adept at manipulating and kind of revaluing educational technology,
Okay.
whether
But
that be
despite-
various
yeah.
platforms, whether it be different apps, digital tools.
But despite educational technology being available, Steve, would you agree that actually you have to go back to what you first said, that it's really the communication skills that needs to be the foundation to continue this teaching and learning, and specifically for English language?
It's the communication. It's two things. It's the communication skills and it's pedagogic skills.
Yes. So the methods of teaching.
Methods of teaching, knowing how to design balanced lessons, right? That, the digital tools are
Yes,
not going
are
to
there.
give us that.
Yes. They won't. It won't.
Because the digital tools need to be our slaves. We
Yes.
should not be the slaves of those tools, in my view.
Okay. So on that note, Steve, so I think we have done a good service to our listeners in that we've been able to impart some of these hard-earned lessons from you through many years that you had to go through them. So maybe you can give some final insights to our audience as to how they move forward, again, as we said, through this new normal, and improve on their English as a second language, as a foreign language, to propel their studies and eventually their careers.
Well, I mean, certainly love of language in general is number one.
Okay.
Desire and the will to communicate is number two.
Okay.
And they have to work together because, English is our only global language, for better or for worse.
Yes.
And English is going to, in spite of the rise of China and whatever, English is going to remain the global language in our lifetime.
Okay.
Absolutely, in my lifetime and in our students' lifetime as well. So young people today need to be very, very well grounded in English proficiency skills.
Okay. So I think you have it straight from the horse's mouth, as they would say. Thank you so much to Professor Stephen Ray Gershon of JF Oberlin University in Tokyo, Japan. Again, Professor of English Language as a second language and as a foreign language textbook author. And of course, our very dear friend who returns to the Philippines when he can. So when are you going to be able to return to the Philippines soon? We will have to see, Steve.
The minute this pandemic is over, I will be there. Trust me.
Okay, so we'll be waiting for you
Yeah.
definitely
Yeah.
in the Philippines. And as we can, this is the final version of our program. So as we will say, stay safe and healthy. And maybe your final greetings in English and Tagalog.
Mabuhay, everybody. Thank you so much. Salamat po. I've really
Okay.
enjoyed talking to you. And certainly next time you would like to speak with me again, please do ask. I'm always happy to chat with you and your viewers and listeners.
Okay. Thank you so much, Steve. And so on
Thank
that
you.
note, we will have to say goodbye to our listeners, and then we will be right back. Thank
And
you
everybody,
so much.
ika ka.
Okay. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.
Good evening to our audience and televiewers from the Philippines and around the world. So this is AAA Live at Katipunan channel. So we're airing every Wednesdays from 7 to 8 in the evening. So you can like, follow, and subscribe to our YouTube and Facebook channels at Katipunan channel. And for tonight, we will be having our guest, Prof.Michael Furmanovsky, and we will be discussing the field of history. So all to our students, parents, stakeholders in the education sector. So I hope that you'll be able to join us and give us your time for this very interesting discussion that we will be having for tonight. So let us welcome Professor Michael Furmanovsky. He's a professor of intercultural communications at the Ryokoku University in Kyoto, Japan. Good evening, Professor Furmanovsky.
Yes, good evening, and thank you for welcoming me to your channel. I'm really excited for your channel and look forward to watching it.
Okay, so this is especially very relevant to us, especially because Professor Furmanovsky is a historian and he's also familiar with the Philippines, having countless visits to our country from his base in Japan. But maybe you can tell us a little bit about your particular field of study and how you came to actually develop your interest in history from the time that you were a student, a young person, until the current time as your professorship in the university.
Yes, I'd be happy to. It's been a long journey, and I've been through many stages. As a child, I was interested in, the kind of stories you get in school. I grew up in Zimbabwe, then called Southern Rhodesia. And so I was living in a country that was always in the news and which had a complicated history involving blacks and whites. So, and also I have a Jewish background. So there were so many things in my own personal life that were part of world history. So it was kind of natural. So then as a teenager growing up in the UK, I tended to be interested in sort of political things, economic things, big matters. And then I went to study in the United States because I had a strong interest in America. And again, I studied the big things, things like slavery, immigration, black-white relations, political movements. That was my PhD work and my research. But then when I came to Japan and I remade myself into an English teacher and got away from all of that, then when I finally came back to history, I merged it with my own personal interest in music and popular culture and decided to become a popular culture historian. So looking at ordinary people's lives, looking at fans, looking at the impact of music, fashion, movies, and so on ordinary people's lives. And so when I go to different countries, I'm always interested in what kind of music they're listening to, what kind of things they're watching on TV, including in the Philippines, So why do people in the Philippines play basketball? What is the Spanish influence? Why do they like particular kinds of music from America, but not other kinds of music from America? So that's sort of what I do now.
Yes. So I think from your background in the field of history, that has really metamorphosed into what you were saying about your current interest, which is more of contemporary culture, as it is impacted by, of course, all of this cultural heritage and influences. So
Yeah.
what do you think should be the skills or proficiencies that should be developed by students, especially because many of our audience and viewers are students, if they really want to develop one, maybe a liking for history, and possibly even look at history as a possible profession or a field of study that they may do in the future?
Yeah, I suppose what I'd probably say is that what you need to have is great curiosity and enjoy the idea of becoming a detective, because being a historian is like being a detective. Now, that's not true for all kinds of historians, because there are people who are intellectual historians and cultural historians, all kinds. But for me, the key thing is sort of trying to figure out what actually happened and looking for clues. So this is me sort of fulfilling my inner detective.
Yes.
And the further back you go in history, of course, the harder and more complicated it gets, because you're dealing with sort of old documents and old languages and so on. In my case, I'm not. My interest is in history when the sort of media began, the real media, whether it be radio, whether it be obviously TV, recorded music, and above all, photography. So I'm very interested in what pictures, photographs tell. So in a sense, my own history is sort of limited by the beginning of mass media. And then it sort of ends when mass media becomes too big and you don't need to be a detective anymore. You need to be more like someone who has to sort out from too much.
Okay.
I'm interested
So maybe
in
we
the
can
period.
backtrack a little bit for our audience and talk about, like you mentioned, about the beginnings or the origin of mass media. So we can talk about like mass communication, because
Yes.
this is when information became available to a lot of people, as compared to before, when you had these previous historical times when knowledge and education was really limited to a number of people. And you've discussed, I think, these different sorts of media that were eventually available. And then now maybe we can relate it to what is happening, because the part of the mass media now would, of course, be the internet, or even today what we're doing is the virtual broadcast. So what do you think from the inception of these photographs that you were talking, which is really like a visual record of history, basically?
Yeah,
What
I
would
mean,
have
it's
been the
really,
influence of like photography for
yes,
us?
photography. Photography sort of starts in the 1850s or 60s, but it tends to be just sort of portrait photography. So you don't really get the kind of photography that can really give you very deep insights into how people lived until maybe the end of the 19th century. I mean, let's take the example of the Philippines, the war,
Yes.
was it the 1920s? I think it is. Most of the
1898, when we revolted against the
1898, and then there's
Spaniards, and then when you had the Philippine-American War, which is
Philippine-American
like
War.
in 7
Right.
yes.
So if I have, this is not my field, but I would ask the question, how many pictures are there of ordinary people's lives at that time?
Possibly
probably-
very few.
Right.
Possibly.
Very, very few, because people didn't think to take pictures. And how much
Yes.
video is there? We've got
Possibly
video of
none.
there might be a tiny amount. There's a fair amount of video of World War One, right? There's
Yes.
even a little bit of video of the Boer War, which is 1905, whatever it is.
Yes.
So I imagine there's a tiny bit, but if you really wanted to reconstruct what happened in the Philippines and how it affected ordinary people, not just soldiers, because we always focus on the military and the politicians, but what was ordinary life, it's very, very limited. But you go ahead another 10 or 15 years and you've got a lot more. And with each year going all the way up to, say, the 1930s, then you're going to have a little bit of newsreel and so on. So I'm interested in how to use these media to reconstruct the lives of ordinary people, not the elite, not the president. And that's what I do for Japan. And most of the history of Japan that I study 99.9% of Japanese know nothing about it.
Absolutely.
because it's
probably
so
not conscious.
yes. I mean, I and they wouldn't understand even the significance of it, because people today are very presentist. They have no sense of historical context. So anyway, it's kind of interesting, because my sister's a professional photographer, but I had no particular interest in photography. But now everything I do is based on images and what the images say, and I've got an enormous sort of collection of pre and post-war photographs.
So from that inception, so you would begin with photography, and then of course eventually it would become audio, and then becomes audio visual,
right?
And now it has metamorphosed into not only broadcast, which is just a one-way wavelengths of communication, but now it's interactive, like what we are doing. So how then do you think this has influenced now our present contemporary historical context for ordinary people, at least?
Well, we're living in a time when there's so much recording going on every day of every possible event and image. So I don't even think that in the future there will be historians in the way we think of it, because for us, a historian is someone trying to make sense of the past from a sort of a limited amount of data. Now, it might be quite a lot of data, right? In the case of World War II, obviously there's archives and so on, but it's kind of limited, and we have to try to reconstruct it and figure out what people were thinking. In the future, people looking back now, there's too much, because everybody's making their own. So the future historians will have to figure out what was important.
Yes.
And they'll have to look at, what were the masses of people doing? Even myself as a music fan, when I look at YouTube videos of musical artists or anything, actually, I look to see how many people, are subscribers or how many people are watching it. So, for example, if it's something like a Taylor Swift or a BTS, these pop megastars, the number of people watching it can be somewhere in the of 1 billion.
Yes.
Now, some people are watching it twice, but you're getting close to 1/10 of the world
population.
Yes. So 1/10 of the world have watched this Korean pop group's video.
Yes, exactly.
So that's quite important, that to keep a note and have an understanding of what is popular and what isn't. Because if everybody can make a video and everybody can make a blog and anybody can do anything, so what is the significance of a particular one?
Exactly. So do you think that the field of history for the future will be more of discernment among all of this vast amount of data that has actually been collected, and to distill, as you said, what would have been relevant and significant at a particular point in history? Yes,
exactly. It's making sense of too much stuff, and then trying to get a sense, well, what did the ordinary person actually think? So, for example, let's say in the future they're trying to evaluate the lockdown in Manila.
Yes.
Of the COVID lockdown, right? How will you make sense of what people actually thought of it? So imagine 20 or 40 years from now, you're posing the question, what was the reaction of the ordinary people of Manila to the lockdown?
Yes.
And how would you gather that information? So would you then go and you couldn't look at everybody's sort of Facebook or everybody's photos or something. It would require a completely different kind of detective work to get a sense of what the ordinary people were thinking.
So therefore, the field of history and the study of history cannot actually become irrelevant in the future, Michael. Future generations will still need to actually study history. Again, as you said, it's possible that they would have to develop a different sort of skill set to distill history in the future.
Yes, they won't be detectives in the sense of people like me with a limited amount. There'll be more people who are able to figure out what the the trends were and make sense of what happened. Another thing is, in my case, if there's one thing that has existed throughout my career, it's an interest in the effect of big events.
Yes.
Okay. So a lot of what I'm doing in my own work, even though it's with music and fashion, is the impact of America's occupation of Japan.
So this
Because
is
that is one of the most
right?
interesting, yeah, it's one of the most interesting events in the history of the world, because it's the only occupation of a defeated country in which there wasn't sort of oppression. In fact, it was sort of the other way around, right? So similarly, the key events in Philippine history, when the Americans came in, and then what did they decide to do? What was their attitude towards the Philippine people? What is it that they gave them, and what is it that the Philippine people wanted and didn't want?
Exactly.
It's quite similar to Japan, right? So they took baseball and basketball, and they took some of the music.
Yes,
right?
but
But they rejected other things.
yes.
And then why did they reject some? Why did they accept others? Same thing in Japan. So in the case of the United States, you're now in Tennessee.
Yes.
Reconstruction, I don't know if you know about Reconstruction, when America,
Of course.
there was a 7-year period
Period.
and the southern states of America were occupied, and anything could happen, right? So
Yes.
possible, it wasn't impossible that a former slave could become a senator.
Yes. Now,
And they did.
after that period, yes.
Yes.
And they did,
So-
yes.
Yeah. So in many ways, the occupation of the South,
Southern states,
America,
yes.
and then there's the occupation of Japan, they're kind of parallels. Because they're both around 7 years in which one country had to sort of try to remake the attitudes of the other country.
So isn't that what they say, Michael, about history actually repeating itself? And so if you are able to identify the different iterations of events that were significant for a particular country or location, you will possibly find parallels in other locations and countries where it might have taken place.
Yes, yes. And you talked before about, it's the intercultural communications, it's the impact of when one country sort of takes over another or has an enormous influence over another country, right? You look at Afghanistan today and you see the women having to, some cases, wear the burqas or whatever it is, or wear all this thing. Have you ever seen videos or interviews with Afghani women in the 1960s?
Yes, or 70s.
In New York.
Yes, because it was a socialist country, actually. Yes, so very different. Or even Iraq, for example.
Right.
Yes,
They were
during the time of,
extremely
Saddam,
and sophisticated. The women in Kabul were wearing miniskirts.
Yes, exactly.
So when we see it now, if we go back 50 years, it's sort of mind-blowing, because we can't imagine that it was once like that, right?
So it was like Back to the Future, correct?
Yeah, Back to the Future, exactly, right?
Yes. So it means that in this field of history, because as you were saying, even from your own personal background and experiences, there are different iterations of what that occurred historically in your own countries that you were in, and different personal histories. And yet there are iterations of what had occurred in the past, even currently, correct? So right now, when you look at contemporary history, because this is what you're looking at, isn't it that you're actually identifying, as you said, as a detective, what were actually the influences and remnants of history as it impacts today?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, when the COVID crisis began, there was some historians started talking about the 1918 to 1920 flu epidemic.
Yes, the Spanish flu epidemic.
Right. Now, what's interesting is that if you go into a history textbook, whether it's America or Europe, a 500-page textbook,
Yes.
and you look up the Spanish flu, it gets half a paragraph
Exactly.
How is that possible when millions
of people actually died,
that
right?
tells you that the way history was written was completely distorted.
Yes.
Because in those days, history was the story of the winners, of the politicians, the military people. So the fact that millions and millions of people died and it only got a paragraph tells you everything you need to know.
Exactly.
And that's only 100 years ago. We're not talking about 1,000 years ago when we have to look at, parchments and paintings.
Yes.
This is 100 years ago, and the history was erased, essentially. And if you go
as compared to, let's talk about like the rise and the fall of the Roman Empire,
exactly,
which until now is treated very significantly with volumes of history books.
Well, there's a million examples of things where there's literally 10,000 books. Now, when I was in my 20s and I went to live in the United States, there were certainly a lot of books about slavery already.
Yes,
but the amount of new ones that were written that were called so-called revisionist history.
Yes.
That's I grew up with revisionist history, which is basically saying that the previous historians were not really doing their job. They were telling a story.
Or they have gotten history wrong, basically.
Got it wrong, or they were telling it from the point of view of the people who won and ignoring the people who didn't. History is written by the winners. So if you're a historian, you're constantly seeing parallels. For example, in the United States today, Biden is embarking on a plan of spending trillions of dollars on all kinds of projects. Now, when did that last happen?
During the time of FDR, after the Great Depression.
Yes, well, it's exactly in 1936.
Yes,
he started to do it, 35, 36. And then it came to an end 3 years later. It petered out.
Yes.
For various reasons, because so many people opposed what he was doing and they talked about how they were overspending. And then it only came back again because of World War II. So if you know that, then when you see what Biden's doing, you know how revolutionary it is, because President Biden is not a revolutionary man. He's a very ordinary sort of mainstream politician. And so was Roosevelt.
Yes,
but both of them are doing things that are more important than perhaps any other human being in the in the last 100 years because of this accident of history. So, people who know what happened in the 30s have a different take on it.
So isn't it a truism that actually people are a product of their milieu, in effect of their historical times of where they were at a particular point in time and how they reacted, they behaved in that particular point in time? It
is, but you see, there's another thing, and you will probably know this where you're living now. How did President Biden is going to change America in the most profound ways, but he's only able to do that because one black woman 3 or 4 years ago got so angry at what happened when she was running for governor of Georgia that she created a campaign for voter registration in Georgia.
Exactly.
Now, nobody took any real notice of what
of that.
But as a result of what she was doing, 2 senators were elected, and now Biden is able to spend $3 trillion. So this tells you that history really has a lot of accidents and totally unforeseen things. And that here's the other thing. Individuals make a huge difference.
Yes.
A lot of the historians from my era tend to look at, if you look at it from a purely Marxist point of view, it's just institutions and economic forces and not people. But my study of history is individuals every single day are making big differences. Okay, so we had this lady in Georgia that made a huge difference when President Trump was elected. The reason he was elected was because maybe one of the reasons he's elected is because when Hillary Clinton was running, she had some kind of negative attitude towards Bernie Sanders. She couldn't put her ego aside and get onto a stage with him, or she didn't do enough just in the state of Michigan. So as a result of that, America had 4 years of, regression. So these kinds of things, you need a historian to make sense of them.
But it's going to be, of course, in hindsight, because all of the things that you were talking about, unintended consequences. I believe that even the people who, as you said, by accident, started a movement, had this behavior, acted in this way, was a product of their milieu, would not have a conception, possibly in their wildest dreams, of where their ideas, concepts, or actions would have taken and influenced and actually impacted others in society beyond what they had initially thought it would happen. Like, look at what happened to Mark Zuckerberg and his Facebook, correct?
Yeah. Right. Getting back to the Philippines, I mentioned before that I grew up in southern Rhodesia, which then became Zimbabwe.
Yes.
Right. Now, when I was in my teens, there were two people in Zimbabwe who, or at that time, southern Rhodesia, two black men who were sort of had movements, right?
Yes.
And in the end, Mugabe won.
Yes.
Now, when he came to power, people like me thought that he was mostly going to do a lot of good things.
Reformist.
There was no reason to think that he would do anything other than good progressive things for his people. He'd been in exile for a long time, working very hard. And when he came to power, he did a number of good things. Then his rival, the guy that grew up where I lived, he then sent in North Korean troops.
Really?
Yes. He got help from the North Koreans to put down the rival group in the area, the Indabeli people, right? And a lot of people were killed, and a lot of people were mystified. What could have happened to this guy? Now, you go back to the Philippines and Marcos.
Yes, what could have happened to him?
There was no reason to think that he was going to become a corrupt dictator when he first came to power. There was every reason to think that he was going to bring a lot of good things to the Philippines. He understood. He was a clever guy. So that it's a parallel. Mugabe and
Marcos.
It helps me to understand Marcos because I know about Mugabe and vice versa. Ask yourself, well, so then what happened?
Yes.
Is it the old thing about corruption? Too much power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Is it this, or is it a psychological thing? What could have possessed these very progressive people who worked very hard and seemed to have their country at heart, then do all of these destructive things? But that's another thing, I'm interested in biographies too. In fact, all my work is really about people. Now, I don't look at the big people. I look at singers and so on, but somebody who wanted to understand what happened to Marcos would have to trace it almost, week by week to see when did he first start to do something that was a sort of a betrayal of what he had earlier stood for. And the same thing with Mugabe, and the same thing with other people who came to power as progressives and then turned into a dictator.
But as you said, isn't history now a collective of all of the people's biographies? And that is what actually makes it societal behavior, because you're actually collating these different biographies. But because for certain, all people, if they are, of course, going through the process of evolution or metamorphosis, will have this life-defining moments that, as you said, would turn the tide towards how they will eventually become. And so this is very important to the young people who are listening to us right now, because whatever it is that they're going to be doing as young people who are conscious that they are alive and they are a part of the world, whatever it is that they will actually become will eventually influence the course of the histories, maybe of the location, the country, or even the world and the historical age, the milieu where they are living.
Yes, I think people, young people in the Philippines could be looking to Myanmar this week or this
Yes.
month and seeing what people their own age from a somewhat similar economic background, right?
Yes.
And seeing what those people are doing. And what are those young people doing? They're doing this. What's
Yes.
this?
Yes. What is that?
You know?
What is the significance, at least in the context of Myanmar?
Well, it's an American drama, right? The
Yes.
what's it called? The Hunger Games or whatever it is.
Yes, the Hunger Games.
And, you know, they've taken this American pop culture. They've got their phones, just like in the Philippines, they got old smartphones, but they're still smartphones.
Yes.
And they can still take videos, and they're changing the world. They're changing their country. Teenagers, people in their early 20s with phones and with their pop culture background, and they're sending these videos out to the world so everyone can see. It's just incredible. And, you know, a year before that, the kids in Hong Kong were doing that, right? Their umbrella revolution.
Yes. So if you talk about like what kind of, as I mentioned, interests, skill sets, proficiencies that young people should look at, not only because they want to actually be historians, but maybe they want to be participants in making history.
Yeah.
What would those be actually, Michael?
Well, I think we know it's just exactly those, you know, people who understand, basically people who understand how people make decisions and how they consume media. I mean, you know, I use Facebook Messenger. That's for old people.
Yes.
Young people would look, what is that? They do everything through Instagram. Their entire world is Instagram. And then they've learned how to use Instagram in all kinds of ways. They use it for connecting with each other. They use it for exchanging information. They use it for making decisions. Pretty soon there'll be something else. And they got TikTok. And it's very difficult for people who are even just 5 years earlier, not 5 years older, not 50 years older, to make sense of what they're doing. But if you can't understand what they're doing, you know, then you don't understand the world. And so when history is being told in 40 years' time, it may well be that things like TikTok and Instagram will be seen as things that shaped the way countries developed.
And so we go back full circle, Michael, to say that history, when it is written or recorded, because right now it's not just only written, but recorded, will always be in the eyes of the beholder. Whoever is the individual who's actually looking through the lens of the past will then interpret it and write and record that this is how it happened.
And it'll be impossible to tell history through a book with text.
Yes, not anymore.
A book with text, black letters on white paper, doesn't tell you what you need to know.
And not anymore, correct. Yeah, so I think so we've come full circle, Michael, to say that what are we now going to look to the future? In terms of like the field of history, what kind of distilled, wisdom or advice can we give to young people who are actually, they are making history as it is happening right now, and for future generations to look at and say, all of these events, behaviors were actually significant and relevant in that particular age, in that particular milieu.
All I would say is record everything, keep it safe, because it's much more easy to delete, right?
Yes.
Delete an old photograph, you have to sort of tear it up and burn it. This can be deleted like that. Keep it safe and look at it periodically. And then
they don't need that is their time capsule.
Yes, exactly. That's their time capsule. They're going to have masses of video to go through. It's going to be difficult because they're going to have too much, not too little, like the previous generation. It'll be too much, but that's the thing. You've got to keep it, and then you can look at it later and figure it out, right? Don't throw it away.
And since you have made the transition, of course, to the academic world, so is this trait of this being having this trait of discernment, is it a characteristic that you see being developed in young people? As a professor, how would you actually want for students to develop that particular skill?
Yes, that's a good question. I mean, young people today are extremely ahistorical, meaning they just don't understand the context. If I show them a movie from 80 years ago, they're going to respond to it with a presentist kind of approach. They can't put themselves back into the past and understand it. And that's my biggest challenge. That is my single biggest challenge. And that's the biggest challenge for any future historian, is how can you help young people to understand what the mindset was at the time? And so often I show students things and they see them, but they don't understand the significance of what they're seeing. So if I show them pictures of women looking extremely modern 80 years ago, which is what I do, Japanese women dressed in Western clothes and looking extremely modern, only about 1 out of 10 students says, wow, that's amazing to think how modern they looked. Others will say, oh, they were a bit old-fashioned in those days, which is completely historical, right?
Yes.
So
how can we overcome this challenge that we're facing when people are actually ahistorical, not having a consciousness about looking at history? Because we know history repeats itself, correct? And if you are not able to learn from the lessons of the past, you are bound to create the same mistakes that has been made in the past.
Well, there's only one thing we can do, and that is to try to make it interesting, just like anything else you teach. If you can make it interesting to them, and that's what my whole life as a teacher, not as a researcher, but as a teacher, is dedicated to making this interesting enough so that students become fascinated by it. I can point out the fact that it was 80 years ago, and so you shouldn't be judging it with a presentist kind of approach. I can say that. Most will not be able to, but if 1 out of 10 gets it, that's enough, right? But so that's but if it's not interesting, then why would they bother, right? And you know, if you're showing students from today's generation something old, if it's black and white, if it's low quality, then they kind of get turned off. They'll say, well, I can't watch that. I can't really enjoy it because it's such low quality and it's black and white, or there's no sound, or it's distorted, right? So you've got
now actually, I think we have to go back to what was being said about, is the medium the message, or is the message the medium? Let's go back to what we were originally talking about, your interest in history and the media that came in. Because now you're talking about the difficulty and the challenges of being able to get the young people interested because they are ahistorical. And so now it's not even the content that we actually want, that's part of it, the distillation of the content. But now you're talking about the medium in order to effectively reach them. And it seems that this generation, I have to say, would have difficulty discerning, is the message the medium, or is the medium the message?
Yes, of course they will, but they are intertwined. And since the mediums are having such a profound effect, like we were talking about in Myanmar and so on, then we don't need to separate them completely. But it's, if you want to sort of get students on your side, if I show them, for example, what video games looked like at the beginning of video games, or I show them what rap music was like when it started, they can relate to that because they still like rap music today and they play video games today. So they see how crude they were, but it's still, they recognize it as of something from their generation. So that's one way to get them interested. Or you have to make analogies and say, well, try to imagine a world where there were no video games or there was no internet. Okay, so how did people communicate? What was their equivalent? The other thing is that it's important that they understand that what people did in the past was amazing. Because if they don't think of it was amazing and showed great ability or artistic expression, then they're going to dismiss it as being inferior. So I show them tap dancing and incredible scenes from 1930s dance movies. And those that are into dance, like dance now, they can see how great it was. And then they suddenly think, wow, people in those days were as good or better than us. Otherwise, they're going to dismiss it.
Isn't history standing on the shoulder of giants? Isn't this one of the greatest lessons that we could actually teach the younger generation, that none of this would have existed if they have not built on the cumulative wisdom, skills, and technology that had happened before us?
Right.
So I think it's really uplifting to have this kind of consciousness develop in the young people. So I think, Michael, again, I hope that our audience would have appreciated that the field of history is actually a study of the people, our ancestors, and how we, descendants, have benefited from what had happened in the past, and how we, now the inheritors of the earth or humanity, will then be the ancestors of the future generations. Isn't that what history is all about?
And history is a study of human beings. Never get away from that. Human beings are interesting, and human behavior is interesting. So if you study human behavior in the past, if you study human behavior on a day-to-day basis like a psychologist, but if you study human behavior, collective behavior in the past, that's history.
So with that, Michael, maybe you can give some parting words to our audience. It was such a very fruitful discussion that we had about how they can look forward to the future by building on a consciousness, developing the skills, the curiosity for the field of history.
Yes, well, all I can say to the young people of the Philippines, because I know that sometimes the textbooks and so on that they have in school, history textbooks, aren't as stimulating as they should be, and that they can now have the whole internet at their disposal to actually bring the kind of dry stories that they're getting in school to life. And when they do that, they'll find out just how interesting it really was, So you don't have to really, the notion that history is boring, which you sometimes hear.
Yes, sometimes, but it's not.
I understand why so many young people have it, because of the way they've been taught. But I think young historians today in the Philippines too are going to change that. So I'm optimistic.
Okay. So with that, thank you so much for making time for us, Michael. We look forward to the time when it is possible for us again to be in contact and for you to return to the Philippines.
I look forward to that more than you can imagine.
So stay safe and healthy, Michael. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We will look forward to your visit very soon. So we'll be right back.
Bye-bye.
And cut. Thank you so much to our guests for this episode, Professor Stephen Ray Gershon of JF Oberlin University and Professor Michael Furmanovsky of Ryokoku University, both based in Japan. And of course, I'd like to give some greetings to our viewers for this evening. I'm so very heartened to listen. Napakaganda po ng inyong mga sinabi. So I'd like to greet, of course, Miss Josie Velasquez and Brad Waray, who are watching, the successor from the Gig. Thank you so much for your compliments to our show. Of course, one for safety. Yes, if you really link it up to our channel, Katipunan channel. So we really want our shows to be thought-provoking. And of course, because we are not bound by what is in the mainstream media, so we really would like for AAA Live to advance your academic goals, to advance and achieve it. And we really want to bring this educational outreach to our people. So makakaasa po kayo na bibigyan po namin kayo ng mga interesante pang mga topic na atin pong ipapaliwanag sa mga susunod nating mga programa. Of course, Batalya Cares PH. So she was saying to invite more Filipino professors. So if you would like to view our previous episodes, you can see that we have interviewed different academic leaders from our Filipino academe, from university presidents to professors to specialists in student services. So tingnan po natin ang ating previous episodes, and don't you worry, in the next episodes, we will be linking up again with the Filipino academic community and see what they are doing para nga po bigyan natin sana ng motivation and inspirasyon ng ating mga kabataan sa Pilipinas para sila ay mag-aral. At sabi nga po ni Dr. Jose Rizal, kasi sila talaga ang pag-asa ng ating bayan. Of course, shout out to the relatives of Miss Cathy Cruz of Tuklasin natin, Uncle Percy and Virgil Cruz. Magandang umaga dito sa Amerika, pero gabi po sa Pilipinas. So sana nasa mabuting kalagayan kayo mula sa kay Miss Cathy Cruz. So I hope everybody enjoyed our episode for tonight. This has been Attorney Amihan April M. ALCAZAR, the President Emeritus of the Philippine Association for Extension Program Implementers. So we have our show here, AAA Live, airing every Wednesdays at Katipunan channel. So please like, follow, and subscribe to our YouTube and Facebook channel. So till next time, every Wednesday, 7 to 8 p.m. and everyone stay safe and healthy. Maraming salamat po, and till next time.
AAA Live!
Inyong napakinggan si Attorney Amihan April ALCAZAR.
AAA Live!
Naway kinapulutan ninyo ng impormasyon at kaalaman ang talakayan ng mga ekspertong nakapanayam mula sa iba't ibang larangan ng edukasyon.
AAA Live!
Ang AAA Live ay mapakikinggan at mapanonood sa Katipunan Channel tuwing araw ng Miyerkules, alas 7 hanggang alas 8 ng gabi.
Where your academic goals will be advanced and achieved. AAA Live!
Hanggang sa muling pagtatanghal.